SARAHPENNER. 1. February 3, 179 1. Nella. She would come at daybreak, the woman whose letter I held in my hands, the woman whose name I did not yet know. I knew neither her age nor where she lived. I did not know her rank in society nor the dark things of which she dreamed when night fell. She could be a victim or a transgressor, a new wife or a vengeful widow, a nursemaid or a courtesan. But despite all that I did not know, I understood this: the woman knew exactly who she wanted dead. I lifted the blush-colored paper, illuminated by the dying flame of a single rush-wick candle. I ran my fingers over the ink of her words, imagining what despair brought the woman to seek out someone like me. Not just an apothecary, but a murderer, a master of disguise. Her request was simple and straightforward. F or my mistress's husband, with his breakfast. D.I. break, for FEB. At once, I drew to mind a middle-aged housemaid, called to do the bidding of her mistress. And with an instinct perfected over the last 2 decades, I knew immediately the remedy most suited to this request: a chicken egg laced with nux vomica. The preparation would take mere minutes, the poison was within reach. But for a reason yet unknown to me, something about the letter left me unsettled. It was not the subtle, woodsy odor of the parchment or the way the lower left corner curled forward slightly, as though once damp with tears. Instead, the disquiet brewed inside of me. An intuitive understanding that something must be avoided. But what unwritten warning could reside on a single sheet of parchment, shrouded beneath pen strokes? None at all, I assured myself. This letter was no omen. My troubling thoughts were merely the result of my fatigue. The hour was late and the persistent discomfort in my joints. I drew my attention to my calfskin register on the table in front of me. My precious register was a record of life and death, an inventory of the many women who sought potions from here, the darkest of apothecary shops. In the front pages of my register, the ink was soft, written with a lighter hand, void of grief and resistance. These faded, worn entries belonged to my mother. This apothecary shop for women's maladies, situated at 3 Back Alley, was hers long before it was mine. On occasion I read her entries: 23 MAR 1767, MRs. R. and Ford, Y arrow M Ilfoil 15 DR3X, and the words evoked memories of her, the way her hair fell against the back of her neck as she ground the yarrow stem with the pestle, or the taut, papery skin of her hand as she plucked seeds from the flower's head. But my mother had not disguised her shop behind a false wall, and she had not slipped her remedies into vessels of dark red wine. She'd had no need to hide. The tinctures she dispensed were meant only for good, soothing the raw, tender parts of a new mother, or bringing menses upon a barren wife. Thus, she filled her register pages with the most benign of herbal remedies. They would raise no suspicion. On my register pages, I wrote things such as nettle and hyssop and amaranth, yes, but also remedies more sinister: nightshade and hellebore and arsenic. Beneath the ink strokes of my register hid betrayal, anguish, and dark secrets. Secrets about the vigorous young man who suffered an ailing heart on the eve of his wedding, or how it came to pass that a healthy new father fell victim to a sudden fever. My register laid it all bare. These were not weak hearts and fevers at all, but thorn apple juice and nightshade slipped into wines and pies by cunning women whose names now stained my register. Oh, but if only the register told my own secret, the truth about how this all began. For I had documented every victim in these pages, all but one, Friedrich. The sharp, black lines of his name defaced only my sullen heart, my scarred womb. I gently closed the register, for I had no use of it tonight, and returned my attention to the letter. What worried me so? The edge of the parchment continued to catch my eye, as though something crawled beneath it. And the longer I remained at my table, the more my belly ached and my fingers trembled. In the distance, beyond the walls of the shop, The bells on a carriage sounded frighteningly similar to the chains on a constable's belt. But I assured myself that the bailiffs would not come tonight, just as they had not come for the last 2 decades. My shop, like my poisons, was too cleverly disguised. No man would find this place. It was buried deep behind a cupboard wall at the base of a twisted alleyway in the darkest depths of London. I drew my eyes to the soot-stained wall that I had not the heart, nor the strength, to scrub clean. An empty bottle on a shelf caught my reflection. My eyes, once bright green like my mother's, now held little life within them. My cheeks, too, once flushed with vitality, were sallow and sunken. I had the appearance of a ghost, much older than my 41 years of age. Tenderly, I began to rub the round bone in my left wrist, swollen with heat like a stone left in the fire and forgotten. The discomfort in my joints had crawled through my body for years. It had grown so severe, I lived not a waking hour without pain. Every poison I dispensed brought a new wave of it upon me. Some evenings, my fingers were so distended and stiff, I felt sure the skin would split open and expose what lay underneath. Killing and secret keeping had done this to me. It had begun to rot me from the inside out, and something inside meant to tear me open. At once, the air grew stagnant, and smoke began to curl into the low stone ceiling of my hidden room. The candle was nearly spent. And soon the laudanum drops would wrap me in their heavy warmth. Night had long ago fallen, and she would arrive in just a few hours, the woman whose name I would add to my register and whose mystery I would begin to unravel, no matter the unease it brewed. Inside of me. 2. P. Resent day, M. Onde. Caroline. I wasn't supposed to be in London alone. Celebratory anniversary trips are meant for 2, not 1, yet as I stepped out of the hotel into the bright light of a summer afternoon in London, the empty space next to me said otherwise. Today our 10th wedding anniversary. James and I should have been together, making our way to the London Eye, the observation wheel overlooking the River Thames. We'd booked a nighttime ride in a VIP capsule, replete with a bottle of sparkling wine and a private host. For weeks, I'd imagined the dimly lit capsule swaying under the starry sky, our laughter punctuated only by the clinking of our champagne glasses and the touching of our lips. But James was an ocean away. And I was in London alone, grieving and furious and jet-lagged, with a life-changing decision to make. Instead of turning south toward the London Eye and the river, I headed in the opposite direction toward St. Paul's and Ludgate Hill. Keeping my eyes open for the nearest pub, I felt every bit a tourist in my grey sneakers and cross-body tote bag. My notebook rested. Inside, the pages covered in blue ink and doodled hearts with an outline of our 10-day itinerary. I'd only just arrived, and yet I couldn't bear to read through our made-for-two agenda and the playful notes we'd written to one another. Southwark, Couples Garden Tour, I'd written on one of the pages. Practice making baby behind a tree, James had scribbled next to it. I'd planned to wear a dress, just in case. Now I no longer needed the notebook, and I'd discarded every plan within. The back of my throat began to burn, tears approaching, as I wondered what else may soon be discarded. Our marriage. James was my college sweetheart. I didn't know life without him. I didn't know myself without him. Would I lose, too, my hopes for a baby? The idea of it made my stomach ache with want of more than just a decent meal. I longed to be a mother, to kiss those tiny, perfect toes and blow raspberries on the round belly of my baby. I'd walked only a block when I spotted the entrance of a pub, the Old Fleet Tavern. But before I could venture inside, a rugged-looking fellow with a clipboard and stained khakis waved me down as I passed him on the sidewalk. With a wide grin on his face, the 50-something-year-old said, "Fancy joining us for mudlarking?" Mudlarking? I thought. Is that some kind of dirt-nesting bird? I forced a smile and shook my head. No, thank you. He wasn't so easily deterred. Ever read any Victorian authors? He asked, his voice barely audible over the screech of a red tour bus. At this, I stopped in my tracks. A decade ago, in college, I'd graduated with a degree in British history. I'd passed my coursework with decent grades, but I'd always been most interested in what lay outside the textbooks. The dry, formulaic chapters simply didn't interest me as much as the musty, antiquated albums stored in the archives of old buildings, or the digitized images of faded ephemera. Playbills, census records, passenger manifest lists I found online. I could lose myself for hours in these seemingly meaningless documents, while my classmates met at coffee shops to study. I couldn't attribute my unconventional interests to anything specific. I only knew that classroom debates about civil revolution and power-hungry world leaders left me yawning. To me, the allure of history lay in the minutiae of life long ago, the untold secrets of ordinary people. I have read a bit, yes, I said. Of course, I loved many of the classic British novels and read voraciously through school. At times, I had wished I'd pursued a degree in literature, as it seemed better suited to my interests. What I didn't tell him was that I hadn't read any Victorian literature or any of my old British favorites, for that matter, in years. If this conversation resulted in a pop quiz, I'd fail miserably. Well, they wrote all about the Midlarkers, those countless souls scrounging about in the river for something old, something valuable. Might get your shoes a bit wet, but there's no better way to immerse yourself in the past. Tide comes in, tide goes out, overturning something new each time. You're welcome to join us on the tour, if you're up for the adventure. First time is always free. We'll be just on the other side of those brick buildings you see there, he pointed. Look for the stairs going to the river. Groups meeting at 2:30, as the tide's going out. I smiled at him. Despite his unkempt appearance, his hazel eyes radiated warmth. Behind him, the wooden plaque reading the Old Fleet Tavern swung on a squeaky hinge, tempting me inside. Thank you, I said, but I'm headed to another appointment. Truth was, I needed a drink. He nodded slowly. Very well, but if you change your mind, we'll be exploring until 5:30 or so. Enjoy, I mumbled, transferring my bag to the other shoulder, expecting to never see the man again. I stepped inside the darkened, damp taproom and nestled into a tall leather chair at the bar. Leaning forward to look at the beers on tap, I cringed as my arms landed in something wet, whatever sweat and ale had been left before me. I ordered a Boddington's and waited impatiently for the cream-colored foam to rise to the surface and settle. At last, I took a deep drink, too worn out to care that I had the beginning of a headache. The ale was lukewarm and a cramp had begun to tug on the left side of my abdomen. The Easterns. I thought again about Charles Dickens, the author's name echoing in my ears like that of an ex-boyfriend, fondly forgotten, an interesting guy, but not promising enough for the long haul. I'd read many of his works. Oliver Twist had been a favorite, followed closely by Great Expectations, but I felt a subtle flash of embarrassment. According to the man I'd met outside, the Victorians wrote all about this thing called midlarking, and yet I didn't even know what the word meant. If James were here next to me, he'd most certainly tease me over the gaff. He'd always joked that I book clubbed my way through college reading Gothic fairy tales late into the night, when, according to him, I should have spent more time analyzing academic journals and developing my own theses about historical and political unrest. Such research, he'd said, was the only way a history degree could benefit anyone, because then I could pursue academia, a doctorate degree, a professorship. In some ways, James had been right. 10 years ago, after graduation, I quickly realized my undergraduate history degree didn't offer the same career prospects as James's accounting degree. While my fruitless job search dragged on, he easily secured a high-paying job at a Big Four accounting firm in Cincinnati. I applied for several teaching roles at local high schools and community colleges, but as James had predicted, they all preferred an advanced degree. Undeterred, I considered this an opportunity to delve further into my studies. With a sense of nervous excitement, I began the application process to attend graduate school at the University of Cambridge, just an hour north of London. James had been adamantly against the idea, and I soon knew why. Just a few months after graduation, he walked me to the end of a pier overlooking the Ohio River, fell to a knee and tearfully asked me to be his wife. Cambridge could have fallen off the map, for all I cared. Cambridge and advanced degrees and every novel ever written by Charles Dickens. From the moment I wrapped my arms around James's neck at the end of that pier and whispered yes, my identity as an aspiring historian rusted away, replaced with my identity as his soon-to-be wife. I tossed my graduate school application into the trash and eagerly thrust myself into the whirlwind of wedding planning, preoccupied with letterpress fonts on invitations and shades of pink for our peony centerpieces. And when the wedding was but a sparkling, riverfront memory, I poured my energy into shopping for our first home. We eventually settled on the perfect place, a 3-bed, 2-bath home at the end of a cul-de-sac in a neighborhood of young families. The routine of married life fell evenly into place, as straight and predictable as the rows of dogwood trees lining the streets of our new neighborhood. And as James began to settle onto the first rung of the corporate ladder, my parents, who owned farmland just east of Cincinnati, presented me with an enticing offer, a salaried job at the family farm, handling basic accounting and administrative tasks. It would be stable, secure. No unknowns. I'd considered the decision over the course of a few days, thinking only briefly of the boxes still in our basement, packed away with the dozens of books I'd adored in school. N. Northanger Abbey. R. Rebecca. Mrs. D. Alloway. What good had they done me? James had been right, burying myself in antiquated documents and tales of haunted manors hadn't resulted in a single job offer. On the contrary, it had cost me tens of thousands of dollars in student loans. I began to resent the books that lay inside those boxes and felt sure my notion about studying at Cambridge had been the wild idea of a restless, unemployed college graduate. Besides, with James's secure job, the right thing to do, the mature thing to do, was to stay put in Cincinnati with my new husband and our new home. I accepted the offer at the family farm, much to James's delight. And Bronte and Dickens and everything else I'd adored for so many years remained in boxes, hidden in the far corner of our basement, unopened and eventually forgotten. In the darkened pub, I took a long, deep drink of my ale. It was a wonder James agreed to come to London at all. While deciding on anniversary destinations, he'd made his preference known, a beachfront resort in the Virgin Islands, where he could waste away the days napping beside an empty cocktail glass. But we'd done a version of this daiquiri-drenched vacation last Christmas, so I begged James to consider something different, like England or Ireland. On the condition that we not waste time on anything too academic, like the rare book restoration workshop I'd briefly mentioned, he finally agreed to London. He relented, he said, because he knew visiting England had once been a dream of mine. A dream which, only days ago, he'd lifted into the air like a crystal glass of champagne and shattered between his fingers. The bartender motioned to my half-empty glass, but I shook my head. One was enough. Feeling restless, I pulled out my phone and opened Facebook Messenger. Rose, my lifelong best friend, had sent me a message. "Why, oh, you doing okay? Love you." Then, here's a pic of little A. Ainsley. "She loves you, too." 3. And there she was, newborn Ainsley, swaddled in grey linen. A perfect, 7-pound newborn, my goddaughter, sleeping sweetly in the arms of my dear friend. I felt grateful she'd been born before I learned of James's secret. I'd been able to spend many sweet content moments with the baby already. In spite of my grief, I smiled. If I lost all else, at least I'd have these two. If social media was any indication, James and I seemed like the only ones in our circle of friends who were not yet pushing strollers and kissing mac and cheese covered cheeks. And although waiting had been tough, it had been right for us. the accounting firm where James worked expected associates to wine and dine clients, often logging 80-some hours per week. Though I'd wanted kids early in our marriage, James didn't want to deal with the stress of long hours and a young family. And so just as he had climbed the corporate ladder every day for a decade, so too did I put that little pink pill on the tip of my tongue and think to myself, someday. I glanced at today's date on my phone, June 2nd. Nearly 4 months had passed since James's firm had promoted him and put him on the partner track, which meant his long days on site with clients were behind him. 4 months since we decided to try for a baby. 4 months since my someday had arrived. But no baby yet. I chewed at my thumbnail and closed my eyes. For the first time in 4 months, I felt glad that we hadn't gotten pregnant. Days ago, our marriage had begun to crumble under the crushing weight of what I'd discovered. Our relationship no longer consisted of just two people. Another woman had intruded on us. What baby deserved such a predicament? No baby deserved it, not mine, not anyone's. There was one problem: my period was due yesterday, and it had not yet shown. I hoped with all my might that jet lag and stress were to blame. I took a final look at my best friend's new child, feeling not envy but unease about the future. I would have loved for my child to be Ainsley's lifelong best friend, to have a connection just like the one I had with Rose. Yet after learning James's secret, I wasn't sure marriage remained in the cards for me, let alone motherhood. For the first time in 10 years, I considered that maybe I'd made a mistake at the edge of that pier, when I told James yes. What if I'd said no, or not yet? I highly doubted I'd still be in Ohio, spending my days at a job I didn't love and my marriage teetering precariously over the edge of a cliff. Would I have lived somewhere in London instead, teaching or researching? Maybe I would have my head stuck in fairy tales, as James liked to joke, but wouldn't that still be better than the nightmare in which I now found myself? I'd always valued my husband's pragmatism and calculated nature. For much of our marriage, I viewed this as James's way of keeping me grounded, safe. When I ventured a spontaneous idea, anything falling outside of his predetermined goals and desires, he'd quickly bring me back to earth with his outline of the risks, the downside. This rationality was, after all, what had propelled him forward at his firm. But now, a world away from James, I wondered for the first time if the dreams I once chased had been little more than an accounting problem to him. He'd been more concerned with return on investment and risk management than he'd been with my own happiness. And what I'd always considered sensible in James seemed, for the first time, something else, stifling and subtly manipulative. I shifted in my seat, pulled my sticky thighs from the leather and flicked off my phone. Dwelling on home and the what could have been would do me no good in London. Thankfully, the few patrons inside the Old Fleet Tavern found nothing amiss about a 34-year-old woman alone at the bar. I appreciated the lack of attention, and the Boddingtons had begun to ease its way through my aching, travel-worn body. I wrapped my hands tightly around the mug, the ring on my left hand pressing uncomfortably against the glass, and finished my drink. As I stepped outside and considered where to go next, a nap at the hotel seemed much deserved. I approached the place where the gentleman in khakis had stopped me earlier, inviting me to go, what was it, mudlarking? No, midlarking. He'd said the group planned to meet just ahead, at the base of the steps, at 2:30. I pulled out my phone and checked the time. It showed 2:35 p.m. I quickened my step, suddenly rejuvenated. 10 years ago, this was exactly the sort of adventure I might have loved, following a kind old British fellow to the River Thames to learn about the Victorians and midlarkers. No doubt James would have resisted this spontaneous adventure, but he wasn't here to hold me back. Alone, I could do whatever I damn well pleased. On my way, I passed the La Grande. Our stay at the swanky hotel had been an anniversary gift from my parents, but hardly gave it a second glance. I approached the river, easily spotting the concrete steps leading down to the water. The muddy, opaque current in the deepest part of the channel churned as though something toiled underneath, agitated. I stepped forward, the pedestrians around me moving on to more predictable ventures. The steps were steeper and in much worse condition than I would have believed in the center of an otherwise modernized city. They were at least 18 inches deep and made of crushed stone, like an ancient concrete. I took them slowly, grateful for my sneakers and my easy-to-carry bag. At the bottom of the steps, I paused, noticing the silence around me. Across the river on the south bank, cars and pedestrians rushed past, but I could hear none of it from this distance. I heard only the soft lapping of the waves at the river's edge, the chime-like sound of pebbles swirling in the water and, above me, the lonely call of a seagull. The mid-larking tour group stood a short distance away, listening attentively to their guide, the man I'd met on the street earlier. Steeling myself, I stepped forward, moving carefully amid the loose stones and muddy puddles. As I approached the group, I willed myself to leave all thoughts of home behind, James, the secret I'd uncovered, our unfulfilled desire for a baby. I needed a break from the grief suffocating me, the thorns of fury so sharp and unexpected they took my breath away. No matter how I decided to spend the next 10 days, there was no use remembering and reliving what I'd learned about James 48 hours ago. Here in London on this celebratory anniversary trip, I needed to discover what I truly wanted, and whether the life I desired still included James and the children we'd hoped to raise together. But to do that, I needed to unbury a few truths of my own. 3. February 4, 179 1. Nella. When 3, Back Alley was a reputable women's apothecary shop belonging to my mother, it consisted of a single room. Alight with the flame of countless candles and often teeming with customers and their babies, the little shop gave a sense of warmth and safety. In those days, it seemed everyone in London knew of the shop for women's maladies, and the heavy oak door at the front of the shop rarely stayed shut for long. But many years ago, after my mother's death, after Frederick's betrayal and after I began dispensing poisons to women across London, it became necessary to divide the space into two separate, distinct sections. This was easily accomplished with the installation of a wall of shelves, which split the room in two. The first room, situated in the front, remained directly accessible from Back Alley. Anyone could open the front door. It was nearly always unlocked, but most would assume they had arrived at the wrong destination. I now kept nothing in the room except an old grain barrel, and who had any interest in a bin of half-rotted pearl barley. Sometimes, if I was lucky, a nest of rats toiled away at one corner of the room, and this gave further impression of disuse and neglect. This room was my first disguise. Indeed, many customers ceased coming. They had heard of my mother's death, and after seeing this empty room, they merely assumed the shop had closed for good. The more curious or nefarious sort, like young boys with sticky fingers, were not deterred by the emptiness. Seeking something to snatch, they'd push deeper into the room, inspecting the shelves for wares or books. But they would find nothing, because I left nothing to steal, nothing of interest at all. And so onward they would go. Onward they always went. What fools they were, all of them, but the women who'd been told where to look by their friends, their sisters, their mothers. Only they knew that the bin of pearl barley served a very important function. It was a means of communication, a hiding place for letters whose contents dared not be uttered aloud. Only they knew that hidden within the wall of shelves, invisible, stood a door leading to my apothecary shop for women's maladies. Only they knew that I waited silently behind the wall, my fingers stained with the residue of poison. It was where I now waited for the woman, my new patron, at daybreak. Hearing the slow creak of the storage room door, I knew she had arrived. I peered through the nearly imperceptible cleft in the column of shelves, aiming to get my first dim look at her. Taken aback, I covered my mouth with trembling fingers. Was it some mistake? This was no woman at all, it was a mere girl, not more than 12 or 13, dressed in a grey woolen gown with a threadbare navy cloak draped over her shoulders. Had she come to the wrong place? Perhaps she was one of those little thieves who was not fooled by my storage room, and she sought something to steal. If that were the case, she'd be better suited at a baker's shop, stealing cherry buns so she could fatten up a bit. But the girl, for her youth, arrived at exactly daybreak. She stood still and sure of herself in the storage room, her gaze directed at the false wall of shelves behind which I stood. No, this was no accidental visitor. At once, I prepared to send her away on account of her age, but I stopped myself. In her note, she had said she needed something for her mistress's husband. What might become of my legacy if this mistress was well known about town, and word got out that I sent a child away? Besides, as I continued to peek at the young girl through the cleft, she held high her head of thick black hair. Her eyes were round and bright, but she did not look down at her feet or back at the front door to the alley. She shivered slightly, but I felt sure it was on account of the cool air rather than her nerves. The girl stood too tall, too proud, for me to think her fearful. With what did she brew her courage? The strict command of her mistress, or something more sinister? I maneuvered the latch out of its hold, swung the column of shelves inward and motioned for the girl to come inside. Her eyes took in the tiny space in an instant, without need to even blink. The room was so small that if the girl and I stood together and spread our arms wide, we could nearly touch the opposite sides of it. I followed her gaze across the shelves at the back wall, littered with glass vials and tin funnels, gollypots and grinding stones. On a second wall, as far as possible from the fire, my mother's oaken cupboard held an assortment of earthenware and porcelain jars, meant for the tinctures and herbs that frayed and decayed in even the faintest light. On the wall nearest the door stood a long narrow counter as tall as the girl's shoulders. On it rested a collection of metal scales, glass and stone weights, and a few bound reference guides on women's maladies. And if the girl were to pry inside the drawers beneath the counter, she would find spoons, corks, candlesticks, pewter plates and dozens of sheets of parchment, many of them spoiled with hurried notes and calculations. Treading carefully around her and latching the door, my most immediate concern was providing my new customer with a sense of safety and discretion. But my fears were unwarranted, for she plopped into one of my two chairs as though she'd been at my shop 100 times. I could see her better now that she sat in the light. Her figure was a slender one, and she had clear, hazel eyes, almost too large for her oval-shaped face. Intertwining her fingers and setting her hands on the table, she looked at me and smiled. "Hello." "Hello," I replied, surprised by her manner. In an instant, I felt a fool for having sensed any doom in the blush-colored letter written by this child. I wondered, too, about her beautiful penmanship at such a young age. As my sense of worry diminished, it was replaced with a relaxed curiosity. I desired to know more of the girl. I turned to the hearth, which claimed one corner of the room. The pot of water that I had set over the fire a short time ago spewed entrails of steam. "I've hot brewed some leaves," I said to the girl. I filled 2 mugs with the brew and set one of them in front of her. She thanked me and pulled her mug toward her. Her gaze came to settle on the table, on which rested our mugs, a single lit candle, my register, and the letter she'd left in the bin of pearl barley, F or my mistress's husband, with his breakfast. D.I. break, for FEB. The girl's cheeks, pink upon her arrival, remained flushed with youth, life. "What kind of leaves?" "Valerian," I told her, "spiced with cinnamon bark. A few sips to warm the body, a few more to brighten and relax the mind." We were quiet, then, for a minute or so, but it was not uncomfortable in the way that it can be between adults. I supposed the girl to be grateful, foremost, to be out of the cold. I gave her a few moments to warm herself, while I went to my counter and busied myself with a few small black stones. They needed smoothing along the grinding board, after which they would make ideal vial stoppers. Aware of the girl watching me, I lifted the first stone and, pressing down with my palm, rolled it, spun it around and rolled it again. 10 or 15 seconds was all I could manage before I had to stop and slow my breath. A year ago, I was stronger, and my strength was such that I could roll and smooth these stones in a matter of minutes, without so much as brushing a hair from my face. But on this day, with the child watching me, I could not go on. My shoulder ached too badly. Oh, how I did not understand this ailment. Months ago it had been born in my elbow, and then shifted into the opposite wrist, and only very recently, the heat had begun to slip into the joints of my fingers. The girl remained still, her fingers wrapped tightly around her mug. "What's that bowl of creamy stuff, over there by the fire?" I turned away from the stones to look at the hearth. "A salve," I said, "of hog's lard and purple foxglove. You're warming it, then, for it's too hard." I paused at her quick understanding. "Yes, that's right. What is the salve for?" Heat rose in my face. I could not tell her that the leaves of purple foxglove, when dried and crushed, sucked the heat and blood from the skin, and therefore assisted a great deal in the days after a woman had birthed a child, an experience unknown to girls the age of this one. "It is for a tear in the skin," I offered, taking a seat. "Oh, a poisonous salve for a tear in the skin." Shaking my head, I said, "No poison in this, child." Her little shoulders tensed. "But Mrs. Amwell, my mistress, told me you sell poison." "I do, but poison is not all I sell. The women who have been here for deadly remedies have seen the extent of my shelves, and some have whispered of it to their most trusted friends. I dispense all sorts of oils and tinctures and drafts, anything an honorable apothecary might require in her shop. Indeed, when I began dispensing poisons many years ago, I did not simply clear my shelves of all but arsenic and opium. I continued to keep the ingredients needed to remedy most afflictions, supplies as benign as clary or tamarisk. Just because a woman has rid herself of one malady, a devious husband, for instance, does not mean she is immune to all other maladies. My register was proof of it. Interspersed among the deadly tonics were also many healing ones. "And only girls come here," the child said. "Did your mistress tell you that, too?" "Yes'm." Well, she was not mistaken. Only girls come here. With the exception of one long ago, no man had ever stepped foot in my shop of poisons. I only aided women. My mother had held tight to this principle, instilling in me from an early age the importance of providing a safe haven, a place of healing for women. London grants little to women in need of tender care. Instead, it crawls with gentlemen's doctors, each as unprincipled and corrupt as the next. My mother committed to giving women a place of refuge, a place where they might be vulnerable and forthcoming about their ailments without the lascivious appraisal of a man. The ideals of gentleman's medicine did not align with my mother's, either. She believed in the proven remedies of the sweet, fertile earth, not the schemes diagrammed in books and studied by bespectacled gentlemen with brandy on their tongues. The young girl in my shop looked around, the light of the flame in her eyes. "How clever. I like this place, though it is a bit dark. How do you know when it is morning?" "There are no windows." I pointed at the clock on the wall. "There is more than one way to tell the time," I said, "and a window would do me no service at all. You must grow tired of the dark, then." Some days, I could not distinguish night from day, as I had lost the intuitive sense of wakefulness long ago. My body seemed always in a state of fatigue. "I am accustomed to it," I said. How strange it was, sitting across from this child. The last child to sit in this very room was me, decades ago, observing my own mother as she worked. But I was not this girl's mother, and her presence began to pull at me in an uncomfortable way. Though her naivete was endearing, she was very young. No matter what she thought of my shop, she could not need anything else. I dispensed the fertility aids, the cramp barks. She was here only for poison, so I aimed to bring us back to the subject at hand. You have not touched your hot brew. She looked at it skeptically. I do not mean to be rude, but Mrs. Amwell told me to be very careful. I held up my hand to stop her. She was a smart girl. I took her mug into my own hands, drank deeply from it and set it back down in front of her. At once, she grabbed the mug and lifted it to her own lips, emptying the entire thing. I was parched, she said. Oh, thank you, how delicious. May I have more? I maneuvered myself out of the chair, taking 2 small steps to the hearth. I tried not to wince as I lifted the heavy pot to refill her mug. What is the matter with your hand? She asked from behind me. What do you mean? You've been holding it funny this whole time, as though it hurts. Did you injure it? No, I said, and it is rude to pry. But I regretted my tone with her instantly. She was merely inquisitive, just as I was once. How old are you? I asked her in a softer tone. 12. I nodded, having expected something thereabouts. Quite young. She hesitated and, by the rhythmic movement of her skirts, I presumed she was tapping her foot on the floor. I have never, she paused. I have never killed anyone. I nearly laughed. You're only a child. I wouldn't expect you to have killed many people in your short life. My eyes fell on a shelf behind her where there rested a small porcelain dish the color of milk. Inside the dish lay 4 brown hen's eggs, poison disguised within. And what is your name? Eliza. Eliza Fanning. Eliza Fanning, I repeated, aged 12. Yes, miss. And your mistress sent you here today, is that right? The arrangement told me that Eliza's mistress must trust her greatly. But the child paused and furrowed her brow, and what she said next surprised me. It was her idea initially, yes, but I was the one to suggest the breakfast table. My master fancies the chop houses for supper with his friends, and sometimes is gone for a full night or 2. I thought breakfast might be the best idea. I looked to Eliza's letter on the table and ran my thumb across one edge. Given her youth, I felt it necessary to remind her of something. And you understand that this will not just harm him. This will not just make him ill, but I slowed my words. This will kill him, as surely as it would kill an animal. That is what you and your mistress intend. Little Eliza looked up at me, her eyes sharp. She folded her hands neatly in front of her. Yes, miss. As she said it, she did not so much as flinch. Presente, Amande. Caroline. Couldn't resist the old call of the river, said a familiar voice. Just ahead, the guide split off from the tour group and stepped toward me, wearing oversize, knee-high galoshes and blue cleaning gloves. I guess not. Truth be told, I still didn't even know what we were doing in the riverbed, but that was part of the appeal of it. I couldn't help but grin at him. Do I need some of those? I nodded at his boots. He shook his head. Your sneakers will be fine, but take a pair of these. From a backpack, he withdrew a pair of used, mud-stained rubber gloves, not unlike his own. Wouldn't want to cut yourself. Come on, we're down here. He started off, then turned back to me. Oh, I'm Alfred, by the way. But they all call me Bachelor Alf. Funny, too, seeing as how I've been married going on 40 years. Not, the old nicknames on account of the fact that I've found so many of them bent up rings. Seeing the confused look on my face as I tugged on my gloves, he went on. Hundreds of years ago, men would bend metal rings to display their strength before asking a lady for her hand. But if the lady didn't want to marry the man, you see, she threw the ring off the bridge and told him off. I've found hundreds of the rings. Seems plenty of gentlemen walked away from this river as bachelors, if you gather what I'm saying. Strange tradition anyhow. I looked down at my hands. My own ring was now hidden beneath a filthy rubber glove. Tradition hadn't done much good for me, either. A few weeks ago, before my life came to a shuddering halt, I bought James a vintage box for his new business cards. The box was made of tin, the traditional gift on a 10th anniversary, meant to signify durability in a marriage. I'd had it engraved with James's initials, and it arrived in the mail the evening before our planned trip to London right on time. But not much else had gone right since then. As soon as the box had arrived, I took it upstairs to hide in my suitcase. As I rummaged about in the closet, I grabbed a few additional items I hadn't yet packed, an assortment of lingerie, a stroppy pair of heels, a few essential oils. I sorted and set aside the lavender, absolute rose and sweet orange, among others. James particularly liked the sweet orange. Sitting cross-legged on the walk-in closet floor, I held up a piece of lingerie I was undecided on, a mess of bright red string that, somehow, fit around one's butt and between one's legs. Shrugging, I tossed it into my suitcase next to a drugstore pregnancy test which, at the time, I desperately hoped to use in London if my period didn't show. Which reminded me the prenatal vitamins. At my doctor's recommendation, I'd begun taking them as soon as we started trying to conceive. As I walked to the bathroom to grab the vitamins, a buzzing sound. James's cell phone on the dresser caught my attention. I gave it a disinterested, passing glance, but it buzzed a second time and 2 letters caught my eye, XO. Trembling, I leaned forward to read the messages. They'd been sent by someone listed in James's contacts as B. I'm going to miss you so much, read the first one. Then. Don't drink so much bubbly that you forget about last Friday. XO. The second message, to my horror, included a picture of black panties inside a desk drawer. Beneath the panties, I recognized a colorful pamphlet with the logo of James's employer. The picture must have been taken at his workplace. I stared at the phone, stunned. Last Friday, I'd spent the night at the hospital with Rose and her husband while Rose was in labor. James had been at the office, working. Or not working, I now suspected. No, it must be some mistake. My palms grew clammy. Downstairs, I heard James moving about the kitchen. I took several steadying breaths and grabbed the phone, my fingers clutching it like a weapon. I rushed down the steps. Who's B? I demanded, holding up the phone to show James. The look in his eyes said it all. Caroline, he said steadily, as though I was a client and he meant to present me with a root cause analysis. It isn't what you think. With a shaky hand, I navigated to the first message. I'm going to miss you so much. I read aloud. James placed his hands on the counter, leaning forward. It's just a co-worker. She's had a thing for me for a few months. We joke about it at the office. Seriously, Caroline, it's nothing. A downright lie. I didn't reveal yet the contents of the second text message. Has anything ever happened between you two? I asked, willing my voice to remain calm. He exhaled slowly, running his hand through his hair. We met at the promotion event a few months ago, he finally said. His firm had hosted a dinner cruise in Chicago for new promotes. Spouses were welcome to attend on their own dime, but we were saving diligently for London and I'd thought nothing of skipping out. We kissed that night, just once, after too much to drink. I could barely see straight. He stepped toward me, his eyes soft, pleading. It was a terrible lapse in judgment. Nothing else has happened, and I haven't seen her since. Another lie. I pushed the phone forward again, pointing to the pair of black panties in the desk drawer. You sure? Because she just sent this picture, telling you not to forget about last Friday. Seems she keeps her underwear in your desk now. A sheen of sweat formed on his forehead as he scrambled for an explanation. It's just a prank, Car. Bullshit, I interrupted, tears spilling down my face. A nameless figure took form in my mind, the woman who owned those tiny black panties, and I understood, for the first time in my life, the incalculable fury that drives some people to murder. You didn't get much work done at the office on Friday, did you? James didn't reply, his silence was as damning as an admission. I knew then I couldn't trust anything else he said. I suspected he'd not only seen the black panties with his own eyes, but he'd probably pulled them off her. James rarely found himself short for words. If nothing serious had happened between the two of them, he'd be adamantly defending himself now. Instead, he remained mute, guilt written all over his crestfallen face. The secret, his actual infidelity, was bad enough. But in this exact moment, the raw, ugly questions about her, and the extent of their relationship, seemed less critical than his harboring of the secret for months. What if I hadn't found the phone? How long would he have hidden this from me? Just last night, we'd made love. How dare he bring that woman's ghost to our bed, the sacred place where we'd been trying to conceive a child? My shoulders shook, my hands trembled. All these nights trying for a baby. Were you thinking of her, instead of? But I gasped over my own words, unable to say the word me. I couldn't bear to attach this travesty to us, to my marriage. Before he could answer, the nausea pressed upward, relentless, and I made a run for the toilet, slamming the bathroom door behind me and locking it. I heaved 5, 7, 10 times, until there remained nothing left inside of me. The roar of a boat engine nearby on the river jolted me out of the memory. I looked up to find Bachelor Alf watching me, his hands spread open. "Are you ready?" he asked. Embarrassed, I nodded, and followed him to a group of 5 or 6 others. A few of them knelt among the rocks, sifting through pebbles. I stepped closer to my guide and spoke in a hushed voice. "I'm sorry, but I don't entirely understand what midlarking is. Are we searching for something?" He looked at me and chuckled, his belly trembling. "I never did tell you, did I? Well, here's all you need to know. The Thames runs straight through the city of London, and for a long way, at that. Little remnants of history, all the way back to the Roman era, can be found right here in the mud if you go searching long enough. Long ago, midlarkers found old coins, rings, pottery, and they'd go on to sell it. That's what the Victorians wrote about, them poor kids trying to buy bread. But here today, we're just searching because we love it. You keep what you find, too, that's our rule. Look, right there," he said, pointing at my foot. "You're about standing on a clay pipe." He leaned over and picked it up. It looked like a narrow stone to me, but Bachelor Alf wore a mile-wide smile. "You'll find 1,000 of these in a day. No big deal, unless it's your first time. This would have been stuffed with tobacco leaves. See, here, the ridges running up the barrel. I'd date this sometime between 1780 and 1820. He paused, waiting for my reaction. I raised my eyebrows and looked closer at the clay pipe, suddenly overcome with the thrill of holding in my hands an object last touched centuries ago. Earlier, Bachelor Alf had said the tide turns over new mysteries each time it advances and recedes. What other old artifacts might be within close reach? I checked my gloves to ensure they were pulled taut around my hands, then knelt down. Perhaps I would find a few more clay pipes, or a coin or bent ring, as Bachelor Alf said. Or maybe I could remove my own ring, bend it in half and toss it into the water to join all the other emblems of failed love. Slowly, I scanned my eyes over the rocks and ran my fingertips across the glistening, rust-colored pebbles. But after a minute of doing this, I frowned. It all looked very much the same. Even if a diamond ring were buried in the silt, I doubted that I would spot it. "Do you have any tips?" I shouted to Bachelor Alf, "or a shovel, perhaps?" He stood a few meters away, inspecting an egg-shaped thing that one of the others had found. He laughed. "The Port of London Authority prohibits shovels, unfortunately, or any digging at all. We're only allowed to search the surface. So it's a bit like fate if you find something, or at least I like to think so. Fate, or a colossal waste of time. But it was the riverbed or a cold, empty king-size bed at the hotel, so I took a few steps forward, closer to the waterline, and knelt down again, waving away a swarm of gnats that hovered at my feet. I scanned my eyes slowly over the pebbles and caught a glimmer of something shiny and reflective. I gasped, ready to call Bachelor Alf over to inspect my find. But as I stepped closer to pull the thin, shiny object toward me, I realized I'd merely grasped the pearl scent, rotting tail of a dead fish. Ugh, I groaned. Gross. Suddenly, there came an excited shriek behind me. I turned to see one of the others, a middle-aged woman bent down low, the tips of her hair almost touching a sandy puddle beneath her, holding up a whitish, sharp-edged rock. She scrubbed furiously at the front of it with her gloved hand and then held it up proudly. Ah, a bit of Delftware. Bachelor Alf exclaimed. Beautiful, too, I might add. Can't find a blue like that anymore. Cerulean, discovered late 18th century. Nowadays, it's a cheap dye. See there. He pointed, tracing the pattern for the excited woman. It appears to be the edge of a canoe, perhaps a dragon boat. The woman happily dropped the fragment into a bag and everyone resumed their search. Listen here, folks, Bachelor Alf explained. The hint is to let your subconscious find the anomaly. Our brains are meant to identify breaks in a pattern. We evolved that way, many millions of years ago. You are not searching for a thing so much as you are searching for an inconsistency of things, or an absence. Well, there were a number of things absent for me at the moment, not the least of which was any security or surety about what the rest of my life might entail. Following James's news, after I'd locked myself in the bathroom, he'd tried to break his way inside where I lay curled up on the bath mat. I begged him to leave me alone. Each time I asked, he responded with some plea, a variation of "Let me make this up to you or I will spend my life fixing this." All I'd wanted was for him to go away. I'd called Rose, too, and shared the entire, miserable thing with her. Aghast and with a crying infant in the background, she'd patiently listened as I told her I couldn't imagine going to London with him the next day to celebrate our anniversary. Then don't go with him, she said. Go alone. Our lives might have looked vastly different at that moment, but in my moment of despair, Rose could clearly see what I could not. I needed to be far, far away from James. I couldn't bear to be so near his hands, his lips. They stirred my imagination, made my stomach churn yet again. In this way, my impending flight to London had been a life vest thrown overboard. I reached for it eagerly, desperately. A few hours before the flight, when James saw me packing the last of my clothes into my suitcase, he looked at me and shook his head in silence, visibly broken, while fury ran hot through my sob-racked, sleep-deprived body. But while I needed time and distance, I had been reminded of James's absence at every turn. The airport check-in attendant looked strangely at me, clicking her bright orange nails against the desk while asking the whereabouts of Mr. Parkewell, the second individual on the reservation. The lady at the hotel desk frowned when I stated that only one room key would be necessary. And now, of course, I found myself in a place I never expected, a muddy riverbed, searching for artifacts and, as Alf had said, inconsistencies. You must trust your instinct more than your eyes, Bachelor Alf went on. As I considered his words, I caught the sulfuric odor of sewage from somewhere downriver, and an unexpected wave of nausea rolled over me. Apparently I wasn't the only one bothered by the smell, as a few others let out an audible groan. That's another reason we don't dig with shovels, Bachelor Alf explained. The odors down here, they're none too pleasant. As I continued to make my way along the edge of the water, searching for an area undisturbed by the others, I took a misstep and ended up ankle deep in a murky puddle. Gasping at the sudden shock of cold water inside my shoe, I considered what Bachelor Alf might say if I bailed early on the tour. Unpleasant smells aside, the adventure had done little to lift my mood. I checked my phone and decided to give it 12 more minutes, until 3 p.m. If things hadn't perked up by then, a small find, even mildly interesting, I'd kindly excuse myself. 12 minutes. A fraction of a lifetime, yet enough to alter the course of it. February 4, 179 1. Nella. I walked to the shelf behind Eliza and retrieved the small, milk-colored dish. Resting inside were the 4 brown hen's eggs, 2 of them slightly larger than the others. I set the dish of eggs onto the table, leaning forward as though badly wanting to reach for the dish. Eliza set her hands on the table, her palms leaving a damp residue. In truth, I saw much of my own childhood self in her, the wide-eyed curiosity about something novel, something that most other children don't get to experience, though that part of me felt 1,000 years dead. The difference was that I had first seen the contents of this shop, the vials and scales and stone weights, at a much younger age than 12. My mother introduced them to me as soon as I had the ability to lift and sort objects, to distinguish one from another, to order and rearrange. When I was only 6 or 7 and my attention span was fleeting, my mother taught me simple, easy things, like colors. The vials of blue and black oil must stay on this shelf, and the red and yellow on that shelf. As I entered adolescence and became more skilled, more discerning, the tasks grew in difficulty. She might, for instance, dump an entire jar of hops onto the table, spread out the dry, bitter cones and ask me to rearrange them according to complexion. As I worked, my mother would toil beside me with her tinctures and brews, explaining to me the difference between scruples and drams, gollipots and cauldrons. These were my playthings. Whereas other children amused themselves with blocks and sticks and cards in muddy alleyways, I spent my entire childhood in this very room. I came to know the color, consistency, and flavor of hundreds of ingredients. I studied the great herbalists and memorized the Latin names within the pharmacopoeias. Indeed, there existed little doubt that someday, I would preserve my mother's shop and carry on her legacy of goodwill to women. I never intended to stain that legacy, to leave it twisted and tarnished. Eggs, Eliza whispered, jolting me from my reverie. She looked up at me, confused. You have a chicken that lays poisonous eggs. Despite the seriousness of my meeting with Eliza, I could not help but laugh. It was a perfectly logical thing for a child to say, and I leaned back in my chair. No, not quite. I lifted one of the eggs, showed it to her and returned it to the dish. You see here, if we look at these 4 eggs together, can you tell me which 2 are the largest? Eliza furrowed her brow, bent down until the table was level with her eyes and studied the eggs for several seconds. Then abruptly she sat up, a proud look on her face, and pointed. These 2, she declared. Good. I nodded. The larger 2. You must remember that. The larger 2, they are the poisonous ones. The large ones, she repeated. She took a sip of her tea. But how? I put 3 of the eggs back in the dish, but kept one of the larger ones out. I turned it in my hand so that my palm cupped the fat base of the egg. What you can't see, Eliza, is a tiny hole here at the top of the egg. It is covered, now, with a matching wax, but if you'd been here yesterday, you would have seen a tiny black dot where I inserted the poison with a needle. It did not break, she exclaimed, as though I had demonstrated a magic trick. And I cannot even see the wax. Precisely. And yet, there is poison inside enough to kill someone. Eliza nodded, gazing at the egg. What kind of poison is it? Nux vomica, rat poison. An egg is the ideal place for the crushed seed, as the yolk viscous and cool preserves it, no different than if there were a baby chicken inside. I returned the egg to the dish with the others. You'll be using the eggs soon. Tomorrow morning, Eliza said. When he is home, my mistress and her husband eat together. She paused, as though imagining the breakfast table laid out before her. I will give my mistress the 2 smaller eggs. And how will you tell them apart, after you have dumped them into the pan? This stumped her, but only briefly. I will cook the smaller eggs first, set them on the plate meant for my mistress, and then cook the larger eggs. Very good, I said. It will not take long. Within seconds, he may complain of a burning sensation in his mouth. Be sure to serve the eggs as hot as you can so he does not know any better, perhaps underneath the gravy or pepper sauce. He will think he's only burned his tongue with the heat. Soon after, he will feel nauseous, and he will most certainly want to lie down. I leaned forward, making sure Eliza clearly understood what I was to say next. I suggest you do not permit yourself to see him after this. Because he will be dead, you mean, she said, expressionless. Not immediately, I explained. In the hours after ingesting Nux vomica, most victims suffer a rigid spine. They may arch backward, like their body has been strung into a bow. I have never seen it myself, but I have been told it is horrifying. Indeed, the cause of a lifetime of nightmares. I leaned back into my chair, softening my gaze. When he dies, of course, this rigidity will release. He will look much more peaceful then. And later, if someone asks to inspect the kitchen or the pans, they will find nothing, I assured her. Because of the magic. Placing my hands in my lap, I shook my head. Little Eliza, let me make it very clear, this is not magic. These are not spells and incantations. These are earthly things, as real as the smudge of dust there on your cheek. I licked the pad of my thumb, bent forward and ran it across her cheek. Satisfied, I sat back in my chair. Magic and disguise may achieve the same end, but I assure you, they are very different things. A look of confusion crossed her face. Do you know the meaning of disguise? I added. She shook her head, shrugged one shoulder. I motioned to the hidden door through which Eliza had come. When you came into the storage room this morning on the other side of where we sit now, did you know that I watched you from a tiny hole set into the wall? I pointed to the entrance of my hidden room. No, she said. I had no idea you were back here. When I first came in and found it empty, I thought you would come in off the alley, behind me. I would very much like one of these hidden rooms in a house someday. I tilted my head toward her. Well, if you have something to hide, you very well might need to build yourself a hidden room. Has it been here always? No. When I was a child and worked here with my mother, there was no need for this room. We did not have poisons back then. The girl frowned. You have not always sold poisons. Not always, no. Though there was little sense in sharing the details with young Eliza, the admission unfurled a painful memory. 20 years ago, my mother developed a cough at the start of the week, a fever by midweek, and was dead by Sunday. Gone in the short span of 6 days. At the age of 21, I had lost my only family, my only friend, my great teacher. My mother's work had become my work, and our tinctures were all I knew about the world. I wished, at the time, that I had died with her. I could hardly keep the shop afloat, such was the sea of grief pulling me under. I couldn't call on my father, having never known him. Decades ago, as a boatman, he'd lived in London several months, just long enough to seduce my mother before his crew set sail again. I had no siblings, few friends to speak of. The life of an apothecary is a strange, solitary one. The very nature of my mother's business meant we spent more time in the companionship of potions than people. After she left me, I believed my heart had fractured, and I feared my mother's legacy and the shop would also meet their demise. But like an elixir splashed onto the very flame of my grief, a young, dark-haired man named Frederick entered my life. At the time, I'd thought the chance encounter a blessing. His presence began to cool and soften so much that had gone awry. He was a meat merchant, making quick work of the mess I'd accumulated since my mother's death, debts I had not paid, dyes I had not inventoried, dues I had not collected. And even after the shop's figures had been fixed, Frederick remained. He did not want to be apart from me, nor me from him. Whereas I'd once thought myself skilled in only the intricacies of my apothecary shop, I soon realized my expertise in other techniques, the release between two bodies, a remedy that couldn't be found in the vials lining my walls. In the weeks to follow, we fell terribly, wonderfully in love. My sea of grief grew shallower, I could breathe again, and I could envision a future with Frederick. I couldn't have known that mere months after falling in love with him, I would dispense a fatal dose of rat poison to kill him. The first betrayal. The first victim. The beginning of a stained legacy. The shop must not have been very amusing back then, Eliza said, turning her head away as though disappointed. No poisons, and no hidden room. Humph. Anyone should like a secret room. Though her innocence was enviable, she was too young to understand the curse of a once-loved place, hidden room or not, that had been marred by loss. It is not about amusement, Eliza. It is about concealment. That is what it means to disguise something. Anyone can buy poison, but you cannot simply drop a pellet of it into one's scrambled eggs, because the officials may find residue or the box of poison in the trash. No, it must be so cleverly disguised that it is untraceable. The poison is disguised in that egg just as my shop is disguised within the bowels of an old storage room. That way, anyone not meant to be here will undoubtedly turn around and leave. The storage room at the front is a measure of protection for me, you might say. Eliza nodded, her bun bobbing at the base of her neck. She would soon be a beautiful young woman, more handsome than most, with her long eyelashes and the sharp angles of her face. She hugged the dish of eggs to her chest. I suppose this is all I need, then. She pulled several coins from her pocket and set them on the table. I counted them quickly, 4 shillings, 6pence. She stood, then touched her lips with her fingertips. But how shall I transport them? I fear they may break inside the pocket of my gown. I had sold poison to women 3 times her age who thought nothing of the vials snapping inside their pocket. Eliza, it seemed, was wiser than all of them put together. I handed her a reddish glass jar and, together, we carefully placed each egg in the jar, then covered it with a centimeter of wood ash, before placing the next egg on top. You must still handle it carefully, I warned. And I placed a hand softly over one of hers. 1 egg will do the trick if it must. Her look darkened, and in that moment I sensed that, despite the youthfulness and buoyancy she had demonstrated thus far, she did indeed understand the gravity of what she meant to do. Thank you, Miss, Nella, I said. Nella claving. And what is his name? Thompson Amwell, she said confidently. Of Warwick Lane, near the cathedral. She lifted up the jar to ensure the eggs were properly nestled within, but then she frowned. A bear, she observed, gazing at the small image etched onto the jar. My mother had decided upon the bear etching long ago, as there were countless back alleys in London, but only ours ran next to a bear alley. The little etching on the jar was harmless enough, and recognized only by those who needed to know. Yes, I urged, so you do not mix up the jar with another one. Eliza stepped to the door. With a steady hand, she ran a single finger down one of the blackened stones near the entrance. It left a sharp line in the soot, revealing a finger-width band of unblemished stone. She smiled, amused as if she'd just drawn me a picture on a spare sheet of paper. Thank you, Miss Nella. I must say that I love your tea and I love this hidden shop, and I very much hope we meet again. I raised my eyebrows. Most of my customers were not killers by trade and, Unless she returned needing a medicinal remedy, I did not expect to see her again. But I merely smiled at the inquisitive girl. "Yes," I said, "perhaps we will meet again." I unlatched the door, swung it in and watched as Eliza exited through the storage room. And out onto the alley, her small frame melting into the shadows outside. Once she had gone, I spent a few minutes thinking about the girl's visit. She was a strange young thing. I had no doubt she would accomplish her task, and I was grateful for the momentary gaiety she brought into my otherwise cheerless shop of poisons. I was glad I had not refused her, glad I had not heeded the ominous feeling first brought on by her letter. Taking my seat once again at the table, I pulled my register close. I turned to the back, locating the next empty space, and prepared to write my entry. Then, dipping the nib into the well of ink, I put it to the paper and wrote, "Thompson M. Well. EGG Prep NV. 4 FEB 179-1. ON account of MS Eliza F. Anning, aged 12. 6. P. Resent Day, M. Onday. Caroline." I shook off the mud from my wet shoe and continued along the edge of the water. As I distanced myself from the rest of the mid-larking tour group, their quiet chatter disappeared, and the soft lapping of the gentle river waves urged me toward the water line. I glanced upward to the sky. A bruised-looking cloud moved overhead. I shivered and waited for it to pass, but more followed close behind. I feared a storm was fast approaching. Crossing my arms, I glanced at the ground around my feet, an unvarying band of gray and copper-colored rocks. LOK4. Inconsistencies, Bachelor Alf had said. I stepped closer to the water, observing the way the low waves seeped toward me and withdrew in a steady, even rhythm, until a boat rushed past, forcing a gush of water close. Then I heard it, a hollow popping sound, like water bubbles caught in a bottle. As the water receded, I stepped closer to the sound and spotted a glass container, bluish in color, nestled between two stones. An old soda bottle, perhaps. I knelt down to inspect it and tugged at the narrow neck of the bottle, but its base was lodged firmly between the stones. While I maneuvered it out, I spotted a tiny image on one side of the bottle. A trademark or company logo, perhaps. I pulled one of the larger rocks away, freeing the object at last and allowing me to lift it from its crevice. The bottle stood no more than 5 inches tall, more of a vial, given its small size, and was made of translucent, sky blue glass, hidden beneath a layer of caked-on mud. I dipped the vial into the water and used my rubber-gloved thumb to scrub away the dirt, then held it up to inspect it more closely. The image on the side seemed a rudimentary etching, likely done by hand rather than with a machine, and appeared to be an animal of some kind. Though I had no idea what I'd found, I thought it sufficiently interesting to hail Bachelor Alf. But he'd already begun walking toward me. "What ya got?" he asked. "Not sure," I said. "Some kind of vial with a little animal etched onto it." Bachelor Alf took the vial, lifting it up to his face. He turned the bottle over and scratched his fingernail against the glass. "How odd. Very much like an apothecary's vial, but typically we'd see other markings: a company name, date, address. Perhaps this is just a household item, then. A way for someone to practice his etching skills. I do hope they improved a bit from this." He stood silent a moment as he studied the bottom of the vial. "The glass is quite uneven in places, too. It's not factory made, that's for sure, so it must be quite old. It's yours to keep if you'd like." He spread his hands wide. "Fascinating, isn't it? This is the best job in the world, if I don't say so myself." I forced a half smile, somewhat envious that I couldn't say the same about my own job. Admittedly, plugging numbers into outdated software on an outdated PC at the family farm didn't often leave me smiling as big as Bachelor Alf did now. Instead, I spent day after day at a wretched yellow oak desk, the same at which my mother worked for more than 3 decades. 10 years ago, unemployed with a new home, the job opportunity at the farm had seemed too good to pass up, but I sometimes wondered why I'd stayed so long. Just because I couldn't teach history at a local school didn't mean I was out of options. Surely something more interesting existed than administrative work at the farm. But kids. With children someday in the picture, the stability of my job was paramount, as James often liked to remind me. And so I'd stayed put, and I'd grown to tolerate the frustration and uncomfortable musings about whether I'd missed out on something bigger. Maybe even something altogether different. As I stood in the riverbed with Bachelor Alf, I considered the possibility that long ago, he also used to work an uninteresting desk job. Did he finally decide that life was too short to be miserable 40 hours a week? Or maybe he was braver than that and bolder than me, and he'd turned his passion midlarking into a career. I considered asking him, but before I had the chance, another member of the tour called him over to inspect a find. I took the vial back from him and leaned forward, intending to put it back in its spot, but a sentimental, wistful part of me refused. I felt a strange connection with whomever last held the vial in their hands, an inherent kinship with the person whose fingerprints last impressed on the glass as mine did now. What tincture had they blended within the sky blue bottle? And who did they mean to help, to heal? My eyes began to sting as I considered the odds of finding this object in the riverbed, a historical artifact, probably once belonging to a person of little significance, someone whose name wasn't recorded in a textbook, but whose life was fascinating all the same. This was precisely what I found so enchanting about history. Centuries might separate me from whomever last held the vial, but we shared in the exact sensation of its cool glass between our fingers. It felt as though the universe, in her strange and nonsensical way, meant to reach out to me, to remind me of the enthusiasm I once had for the trifling bits of bygone eras, if only I could look beneath the dirt that had accumulated over time. It dawned on me then that since touching down at Heathrow this morning, I hadn't cried once over James. And wasn't that exactly why I ran off to London, anyway? To cut away, if only for a few minutes, the malignant mass of grief? I fled to London to breathe, and that was damn well what I'd done, even if some of that time had been spent in a veritable mud pit. I knew that keeping the vial was exactly what I should do. Not only because I felt a subtle attachment to whomever this vial once belonged, but because I'd found it on a midlarking tour that wasn't even part of the original, fated itinerary with James. I'd come to this riverbed alone. I'd stuck my hands into the muddy crevice of 2 rocks. I'd staved off tears. This glass object, delicate and yet still intact, somewhat like myself, was proof that I could be brave, adventurous, and do hard things on my own. I dropped the vial into my pocket. The clouds above us continued to build, and lightning struck somewhere to the west of the bend in the river. Bachelor Alf called us over to him. "Sorry, folks," he hollered, "but we can't go on after a lightning strike. Let's pack it up. We'll be back out tomorrow, same time, if anyone wants to join again." Pulling off my gloves, I walked over to Bachelor Alf. Now that I'd grown somewhat accustomed to my surroundings, I couldn't help a sense of disappointment about the tour ending early. After all, I'd just had my first real find, and I felt a growing curiosity and the urge to keep looking. I could see how such a pastime might become addictive. "If you were me," I asked Alf, "where would you go to learn more about the vial?" Even though it didn't have the markings Alf expected on a typical apothecary vial, perhaps I could still glean some information about it, especially given the tiny animal etched onto the side, which I thought resembled a bear walking on all fours. Giving me a warm smile, he shook off my gloves and threw them in a bucket with the others. "Oh, I suppose you could take it to a hobbyist or collector who studies glass making. Polishes and molds and techniques change over time, so perhaps someone could help you date it." I nodded my head, having not the slightest idea how to find a hobbyist glassmaker. "Do you think it's from here, somewhere in London?" Earlier, I'd overheard Bachelor Alf telling another tour participant that Windsor Castle was about 40 kilometers to the west. Who knew how far the vial had traveled, and from where? He raised an eyebrow. Without an address or any text to help us? Almost impossible to determine. Above us, a roll of thunder warned. Bachelor Alf hesitated, torn between wanting to help an inquisitive novice like myself and keeping us both dry and safe. "Look," he said. "Try headin' over to the British Library and ask for Gaynor at the maps desk. You can tell her I sent you." He checked his watch. "Not open much longer today, so you best get moving. Take the Underground, Thames link to St. Pancras. It'll be fastest and driest. Plus, it's not a bad place to wait out a storm." I thanked him and hurried off, hoping I still had a few minutes left before the storm let loose. I pulled out my phone, sighed in relief that the station was only a few blocks away, and resigned myself to the fact that if I'd be spending 10 days alone in the city, it was due time to learn how to use the underground trains. Leaving the train station amid a downpour, I spotted the British Library just ahead. I started jogging, tugging at my collar in a futile attempt to air out the inside of my shirt. And to make matters worse, my shoe, which had filled with water when I stepped in the puddle along the river, remained soaked through. When I finally stepped into the library, I took one look at my reflection in the window and sighed, fearing that Gaynor may send me away on account of my disheveled appearance. Pedestrians, tourists, and students filled the foyer of the library, all of us taking shelter from the rain. And yet, I felt like the only one, without a real reason to be there. Whereas many others carried backpacks and cameras, I'd arrived with only a piece of unidentified glass in my pocket and the first name of someone who may or may not be an actual employee. For a moment, I considered the idea of throwing in the towel. Maybe it was time to find a sandwich and plan a real itinerary. The moment this thought crossed my mind, I shook my head. That sounded exactly like something James would say. As rain continued to batter the glass windows of the library, I willed myself to ignore this voice of reason, the same one that had told me to rip up my Cambridge application and encouraged me to take a job at the family farm. Instead, I asked myself what the old Caroline would do, the Caroline of a decade ago, the zealous student not yet dazzled by a diamond on her finger. I stepped toward the staircase where a group of wide-eyed tourists milled about, a brochure spread wide in front of them and umbrella bags scattered at their feet. Near the staircase was a desk with a young female attendant. I approached her, relieved when she showed no dismay at my wet, unkempt clothes. I told her that I needed to speak with Gaynor, but the attendant chuckled. "We have more than 1,000 employees," she said. "Do you know which department she works in?" "Maps," I said, at once feeling slightly more legitimate than I did a moment ago. The attendant checked her computer, nodded her head and confirmed that a Gaynor Beaumont worked at the Inquirer desk, Maps reading room, 3rd floor. She pointed me to the elevators. A few minutes later, I stood at the Inquirer desk in the Maps room, watching as an attractive 30-something woman with wavy auburn hair leaned over a black and white map with a magnifying glass in one hand and a pencil in the other, her brow twisted in deep concentration. After a minute or two, she stood to stretch her back, startling when she saw me. "I'm sorry to bother you," I whispered in the near silent room. "I'm looking for Gaynor." Her eyes met mine and she smiled. "You came to the right place. I am Gaynor." She set down the magnifying glass and brushed aside a loose hair. "How can I help you?" Now that I stood in front of her, my request seemed ridiculous. Clearly, the map in front of her, a haphazard mess of tangled lines and minuscule labels, was an important point of research for her at the moment. "I can come back," I offered, halfway hoping she would seize the idea, send me off and thereby force me to do something more productive with this day. "Oh, don't be silly. This map is 150 years old. Nothing's going to change in the next 5 minutes. I reached into my pocket, drawing a confused look from Gaynor. She was probably more accustomed to students hauling in long tubes of parchment rather than rain-soaked women reaching for small objects in their pocket. I found this a bit ago at the river. I was midlarking with a group led by someone named Alf and he told me to come see you. Do you know him? Gaynor grinned widely. He's my dad, actually. Oh. I exclaimed, drawing an irritated look from a nearby patron. How sneaky of Bachelor Alf to not tell me. Well, there's a small image on the side here, I pointed, and it's the only marking on the vial. I think it's a bear. I couldn't help but wonder where it might have come from. She tilted her head, curious. Most people would have no interest in such a thing. Gaynor extended her palm, and I handed her the vial. You must be a historian, or a researcher. I smiled. Not professionally, no. But I do have some interest in history. Gaynor glanced up at me. We're kindred spirits. I see all sorts of maps at my job, but the old, obscure ones are my favorite. Always a bit of room for interpretation, as places evolve quite a bit over time. Places and people, I thought to myself. I could feel the change in myself at this very moment, the discontent within me seizing the possibility of adventure, an excursion into my long-lost enthusiasm for eras past. Gaynor lifted the vial to the light. I've seen a few antiquated vials like this, though normally they're a bit larger. I always thought them rather off-putting, as you don't really know what was once inside. Blood or arsenic, I imagined as a child. She looked more closely at the etching, running her finger over the miniature animal. It does look like a little bear. Strange there are no other markings, but safe to say it probably belonged to a shop owner at one time, likely an apothecary. She sighed, handing the vial back to me. My dad has a heart of gold, but I don't know why he sent you to me. I really have no idea what this vial is, or where it's from. She looked back down at the map in front of her, a gentle way to tell me that our short conversation was over. It was a dead end, and my face fell as disappointment crept in. I thanked Gaynor for her time, pocketed the vial and stepped away from the desk. But as I turned, she called out after me. Pardon, miss, I didn't catch your name. Caroline. Caroline Parkewell. Are you visiting from the States? I smiled. My accent gives me away, I'm sure. Yes, I'm visiting. Gaynor picked up a pen and leaned over her map. Well, Caroline. If there's anything else I can help with, or if you learn something about the vial, I'd love to know. Of course, I said, then I pocketed the vial. Somewhat discouraged, I resolved to forget the object and the midlarking adventure altogether. I didn't much believe in the fate of finding things, anyway. 7. February 5, 179-1. Eliza. I woke to a pain in my belly unlike any I had felt before. I placed my hands underneath my night shift and pressed my fingers into my skin. Beneath them, my skin felt warm and swollen, and I clenched my teeth as a dull ache began to spread itself wide. It was not the same bellyache I might have had after too many sweets, or after spinning round in the summer garden with the fireflies back home. This ache was lower, like I needed to relieve myself. I rushed over to my chamber pot, but the heaviness still did not go away. Oh, but what an important task lay ahead of me. The most important one my mistress had ever given me. It was more important than any dish I had scoured, or pudding I had baked, or envelope I had sealed. I could not disappoint her by saying I did not feel well and would like to stay in bed. Those excuses might have worked on the farm with my parents on a day when the horses needed brushing or the beans were ready to be plucked from their stalks. But not today, not in the towering brick house belonging to the Amwells. Wiggling out of my night shift and walking to the wash basin, I resolved to ignore the discomfort. As I washed, as I tidied my garret room and as I stroked the nameless fat tabby cat who slept at the end of my cot, I whispered quietly to myself, as though saying it aloud made it more believable, "This morning, I will give him the poisonous eggs." The eggs. They remained nestled in the jar of ash, tucked into the pocket of my gown hanging near the bed. I removed the jar and pulled it to my chest, the coolness of the glass reaching me even through my nightgown. As I clutched the jar more tightly, my hands did not shake, not one bit. I was a brave girl, at least about some things. 2 years ago at the age of 10, I rode with my mother from our small village of Swindon to the great, sprawling city of London. I had never been to London and had heard only rumors of its filth and its wealth. An inhospitable place for people like us, my father, a farmer, had always muttered. But my mother disagreed. Privately, she would tell me of London's bright colours, the golden steeples of the churches, the peacock blues of the gowns, and of the many peculiar shops and stores in the city. She described exotic animals wearing waistcoats, their handlers ushering them through the city streets, and market stands selling hot almond cherry buns to a line of customers 3 dozen deep. For a girl like me, surrounded by livestock and wild shrubs bearing little more than bitter fruit, such a place was unthinkable. With 4 older brothers to help on the farm, my mother had insisted on finding a placement for me in London once I reached the proper age. She knew if I did not leave the countryside at a tender age, I would never see a life outside the pastures and pig pens. My parents had argued about it for months, but my mother would not relent, not even a bit. The morning of my departure was a tearful, tense one. My father hated to lose 2 good hands on the farm, my mother hated the separation from her youngest child. "I feel as though I'm slicing off a piece of my heart," she sobbed, smoothing out the lap quilt she'd just placed into my case. "But I will not let it doom you to a life like mine." Our destination was the servants' registry office. As we rode into town, my mother leaned close, the sadness in her voice now replaced with exhilaration. "You must begin where life has slotted you," she said, gripping my knee, "and move upward from there. There is nothing wrong with starting as a scullery maid or housemaid. Besides, London is a magical place." "What do you mean by magical, mother?" I'd asked, my eyes wide as the city began to come into view. The day was clear and blue. Already, I imagined the calluses on my hands growing smaller. "I mean that you can be anything you want in London," she replied. "Nothing great awaits you in the farm fields. The fences would have kept you in, as they do the pigs and as they've done to me. But in London? Well, in time, if you are clever about it, you can wield your own power like a magician. In a city so grand, even a poor girl can transform into whatever she desires to be." "Like an indigo butterfly," I said, thinking of the glassy cocoons I'd seen in the moorland during summer. In a matter of days, the cocoons would turn black as soot, as if the animal inside had shriveled up to die. But then, the darkness would lift, revealing the butterfly's striking blue wings within the papery encasement. Soon after, the wings would pierce the cocoon, and the butterfly would take flight. "Yes, like a butterfly," my mother agreed. "Even powerful men cannot explain what happens inside a cocoon. It is magic, surely, just like that which happens inside London." From that moment forward, I desired to know more of this thing called magic, and I could hardly wait to explore the city in which we'd just arrived. At the servants' registry office, my mother stood patiently aside while a pair of women looked me over. One of them was Mrs. Amwell, in a pink satin gown and a cap bordered with lace. I could hardly keep from staring. I had never in all my life seen a pink satin gown. Mrs. Amwell seemed to take an instant liking to me. She bent forward to speak to me, crouching low so our faces almost touched, and soon after she placed her arm around my mother, whose eyes were brimming again with tears. I was delighted when Mrs. Amwell finally took my hand in hers, walked me to the broad mahogany desk at the front of the office and asked the attendant for the papers. As she filled in the required information, I noticed that Mrs. Amwell's hand shook badly as she wrote, and it seemed a great effort to keep the nib of the pen steady. Her words were jagged and bent at odd angles, but it meant little to me. I had been unable to read in those days, and all handwriting looked as illegible as the next. After a tearful goodbye with my mother, my new mistress and I took a coach to the house she shared with Mr. Amwell, her husband. I was to work first in the scullery, and so Mrs. Amwell introduced me to Sally, the cook and kitchen maid. In the weeks to follow, Sally minced no words. According to her, I did not know the proper way to scour a pot or how to pick roots from a potato without damaging the flesh. As she showed me the right way of doing things, I put up no complaint, for I enjoyed my placement with the Amwells. I had my own room in the attic, which was more than my mother had told me to expect, and from there I could watch the amusing, ever-present activity on the street below, the sedan chairs rushing past, the porters bearing enormous boxes of unseen goods, the comings and goings of a young couple who I believed newly in love. Eventually, Sally grew comfortable with my abilities and began allowing me to assist in the preparation of meals. It felt a small movement upward, just as my mother had said, and it gave me hope. Someday, I, too, hope to be toiling about in the magnificent streets of London, in pursuit of something greater than potatoes and pots. One morning, while I was carefully arranging dried herbs on a platter, a housemaid rushed downstairs. Mrs. Amwell wanted to see me in her drawing room. Terror struck me at once. I felt sure I had done something wrong, and I ascended the stairs slowly, held back by a sense of dread. I had been at the Amwell house not even 2 months. My mother would be horrified if I were dismissed in such a short time. But when I stepped into my mistress's pale blue drawing room and she closed the door behind me, she merely smiled and asked me to sit down next to her at her writing desk. Here, she opened a book and produced a blank sheet of paper, a pen, and an inkwell. She pointed at several words in the book and asked me to write them down. I was not comfortable holding a pen, not at all, but I pulled the page close and steadily copied the words as best I could. Mrs. Amwell watched me closely as I worked, her brow knit together, her chin in her hands. When I finished the first few words, she selected several more, and almost immediately I noticed an improvement in my own pen strokes. My mistress must have noticed it, too, for she nodded approvingly. Next, she pushed aside the sheet of paper and lifted the book. She asked if I understood any of the words, and I shook my head. She then pointed at several of the shorter words she, card, plum and explained how each letter made its own sound, and how words strung together on paper could convey an idea, a story. Like magic, I thought. It was everywhere, if only one knew to look. That afternoon in the drawing room was our first lesson. Our first of countless lessons, sometimes twice a day, for my mistress's condition, which I'd first noticed at the registry office, had worsened. The tremor in her hand had grown so severe, she could no longer write her own correspondence, and she needed me to do it for her. In time, I worked in the kitchen less and less, and Mrs. Amwell called me often to her drawing room. This was not well received by the other household staff, Sally most of all. But I didn't worry myself over it. Mrs. Amwell was my mistress, not Sally, and I couldn't refuse the ganache balls and ribbons and penmanship lessons by the drawing room hearth, now, could I? It took me many months to learn to read and write, and even longer to learn how to speak like a child who had not come from the country. But Mrs. Amwell was a wonderful tutor, gentle and soft-spoken, wrapping my hand in hers to form the letters, laughing with me when the pen slipped. Any lingering thoughts of home vanished, it shamed me to admit, but I did not want to see the farm, not ever again. I wanted to remain in London, in the grandeur of my mistress's drawing room. Those long afternoons at her writing desk, when I was burdened only by the gazes of the jealous servants, were some of my best memories. Then something changed. A year ago, When the roundness of my face began to fall away and the edge of my bodice grew tight, I could ignore it no longer, the feeling of another gaze, a new one, and the sensation that someone watched me too closely. It was Mr. Well, my mistress's husband. He had, for reasons I could only faintly understand, begun to pay attention to me. And I felt sure my mistress sensed it, too. It was almost time. My bellyache was not so bad anymore, moving about the kitchen seemed to help. I was grateful for it, as following Nella's instructions would require me to be careful and steady. A slip of my hand, which might be laughed about in my mistress's drawing room, would be very bad today. The 2 smaller eggs sizzled in the pan. The fat spit onto my apron while the white edges of the egg bubbled and curled. I remained still, concentrating, and spooned the eggs from the pan when the edges reached the color of honey, just as the mistress liked. I placed her eggs on a plate, covered them with a cloth and set them far aside. I then spent a few minutes tending to the gravy, which was Nella's suggestion. As the gravy thickened, I realized it was the final moment to undo what I had not yet done, to strip out the thread which had not yet been sewn in. If I followed through, I would be like one of those men at Tyburn that I'd heard about at the hanging day fairs, a criminal. Goose flesh scurried across my skin as I thought of it, and I considered briefly the idea of lying to my mistress, telling her that the poisoned egg must have been too weak. I shook my head. Such a lie would be cowardly, and Mr. Well would remain alive. The plan which Mrs. Well had set into motion would fail because of me. I wasn't meant to be in the kitchen at all today. Last week, Sally had asked Mrs. Well for a few days away to visit her ailing mother. My mistress had readily approved and, afterward, called me to her drawing room for another lesson. But this lesson was not about penmanship or letter writing, it was about the hidden apothecary shop. She told me that I was to leave a note in the bin of pearl barley just inside the door of 3 back alley, and that the note should specify the date and time I meant to return for the remedy, which was, of course, a deadly one. I did not ask my mistress why she meant to harm her husband. I suspected it was because of what happened a month ago, just after the New Year, when my mistress left the house and spent the day at the winter gardens near Lambeth. That day, Mrs. Well had asked me to organize a pile of her letters, giving me several dozen to sort before leaving for the gardens, but I could not complete my task because of a headache. Mid-morning, Mr. Well stumbled upon me with tears on my cheeks. The pressure behind my eyes had become almost unbearable. He insisted that I retire to my room and sleep. A few minutes later, he offered me a drink that he said would help, and I sucked down the sharp, honey-colored liquid as quickly as I could, even though it made me cough and gasp. It looked like the brandy my mistress sometimes sipped from the bottle, though I could not fathom why anyone would willingly drink such a thing. I slept away the headache in the quiet, sunny comfort of my room. Eventually, I woke to the smell of animal fat, a tallow candle, and my mistress's cool touch on my forehead. The ache in my head had gone. Mrs. Well asked me how long I had been asleep, and I told her truthfully that I did not know that I had lain down mid-morning. It is now 10:30 at night, she told me, meaning I had slept for nearly 12 hours. Mrs. Well asked if I had had any dreams. Although I shook my head, the truth was that a faint memory had begun to form, one I felt sure was a dream I'd had only a few hours ago. It was a memory of Mr. Well in my garret room. He had lifted the fat tabby cat from her place on my cot and set her into the corridor, then closed the door and approached me. He took a seat next to me, placing his hand on my stomach, and we began to talk. Try as I might, I could not remember what we discussed in the dream. He then began to move his hand upward, sliding it along my navel, when one of the footmen made a commotion downstairs. A pair of gentlemen had arrived, needing to speak urgently with Mr. Well. I admitted the story to my mistress, but I said that I did not know whether it had been a dream or real. Afterward, she remained at my side, a concerned look on her face. She pointed at the empty brandy glass and asked if Mr. Amwell had given it to me. I told her yes. She then leaned in close and placed one of her hands on mine. Is it the first time he has done so? I nodded. And you are well now? Nothing hurts. I shook my head. Nothing hurt. My mistress eyed the glass carefully, tucked the blankets in close around me and wished me good night. It was only after she had gone that I heard the soft cry of the tabby cat outside my room. She was in the corridor, mewing to be let inside. Now, I handled each of the larger eggs like they were made of glass. It was a tricky thing, to be sure, and I had never given so much thought to the pressure with which I cracked an egg. The pan was still very hot, and the yolks began to cook almost instantly. I feared to stand too close, lest I breathe in any poisonous odors, so I tended the eggs with a long, outstretched arm, and soon my shoulder ached like it did when I used to climb trees in the country. Once cooked, I removed the 2 larger eggs to a second plate. I smothered them in gravy and threw the 4 eggshells into the rubbish bin, straightened my apron, and being very sure to place the poisoned eggs on the right side of the tray, I left the kitchen. The master and mistress were already seated, engaged in a quiet discussion about an upcoming banquet. Mr. Batford says there will be a display of sculptures, Mrs. Amwell said. Procured from all over the world. Mr. Amwell grunted in response, looking up at me as I entered the dining room. Aha, he said. Here we are. Beautiful things, he's promised. My mistress rubbed at her collarbone, where her fingers touched. The skin was red and splotchy. She seemed jittery, even though I carried the tray of poisonous eggs, and this annoyed me somewhat. She had been too scared to retrieve the eggs herself, and now she seemed unable to calm her nerves. He said to her, his eyes never leaving me. Bring that over here. Quickly now, girl. Stepping close to him from behind, I lifted his plate from the right side of the tray and carefully set it in front of him. As I did so, he reached his hand behind my legs and delicately pulled the heavy fabric of my skirt upward. He ran his hand over the back of my knee and upward to my lower thigh. Lovely, he said, finally pulling his hand away and lifting his fork. My leg itched where he touched it, an invisible rash beneath my skin. I stepped away from him and set the second plate in front of the mistress. She nodded at me, her collarbone still flushed. Her eyes were sad and dark, as dim as the maroon rosettes on the papered wall behind her. I took my place at the edge of the dining room and waited, still as stone, for what would come next. 8. Presente, Amande. Caroline. When I woke later that night, the nightstand clock showed 3 a.m. I groaned and turned away from the dim red light, but as I tried to fall back asleep, my stomach began to churn and an unsettled sensation left my skin damp and hot to the touch. I pushed the covers back, wiped sweat from my upper lip and stood to check the thermostat. It was programmed in Celsius, not Fahrenheit, so perhaps I'd accidentally set it too warm the day before. I shuffled my feet along the carpeted floors, stopped to steady myself and threw my hand against the wall. Suddenly, I heaved. I dashed for the bathroom, hardly making it to the toilet before vomiting up everything I'd eaten the day prior. Once, twice, 3 times I retched, my body limp over the toilet. Afterward, as my stomach unclenched and I caught my breath, I reached for a washcloth on the counter. My hand knocked over something small and solid. The vial. After I'd returned to the hotel, I'd taken it out of my purse and set it on the bathroom counter. Now, to prevent myself from nearly shattering it, I tucked the vial safely at the bottom of my suitcase and returned to the bathroom to brush my teeth. Food poisoning in a foreign country, I thought to myself, groaning. But then I covered my mouth with trembling, damp fingers. Food poisoning, or something else. Hadn't I been queasy a couple times yesterday, too? I'd hardly eaten anything, so I couldn't blame that nausea on bad food. It felt, At once, like a terrible joke if I was indeed pregnant, this was not how I imagined it happening. I'd long dreamed about the moment that James and I learned the news together, the happy tears, the celebratory kiss, rushing out to buy our first baby book. The two of us, together, celebrating what